Hey, Stage.
I am sharing my screen now. Sharing my screen. Sharing main screen now. And the PowerPoint, which is and then I will close this way so you can have the full screen access there.
Okay. And then what will happen is that screen over there what they'll see? They'll see.
No, they will see the PowerPoints in their own screen. This is just a reflection of you.
I see. So they won't actually see me when I'm.
They will see you.
Talk.
They will see you as well.
And it'll be an insert.
It'll be an insert. They can expand it or contract it as they please.
I think most of them will contract it. If I were them, that's what I'd be doing. All right.
Yeah, so we've had some different things. We've covered, well, of course, infectious diseases. We've covered chronic conditions, mental health. We've covered. Well, actually, Dr. Chill is going to come in November to discuss the literary perspective of One Health of Medicine.
Really?
They're looking at maybe different books. He gave interesting little welcome remarks, I think in January, looking at the veterinary school actually, looking at some authors and how they reflected the animal experience from a humanistic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an interesting slant to add to it.
Joe's a Joe's an excellent teacher.
Yeah.
You know, the other interesting thing that sort of overlaps with him is literacy. You know, is functional literacy and its impact on health, including the impact on health of animals and others. It is interesting to see how we haven't really taken that into account in many of our public health interventions with people. Is functional literacy.
Very good. So once 12 o'clock hits, we basically go live.
Good. All right.
Yeah. And this course is being offered for credit.
And make sure that's off. In fact, maybe I should just turn the thing off or put it on
Silent.
Well, it is on silent, but the problem is if it vibrates, they'll pick up on it.
Okay. Yeah.
So what I'll do is put it on
Airplane mode.
airplane mode.
That works.
Just remember to turn it back on.
So we've linked the course with our National Board of Public Health Examiners,
Mm-hmm.
so we can offer continuing education credits through their support. And over the course of 12 months, 12 sessions, at the end of the session, we have a discussion question on a blog that opens up so people can actually have a conversation on the presentation itself. And then in December, you can apply for your credits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is this CME credit or what?
It's public health.
Public health?
Yeah, continuing education credits, yeah.
But CME credit would be useful too. You know, that's often that's often something that licensed physicians all have to maintain about 30 to 40 CME credits a year, and many of them will get their CME credits online. So, you know, we've actually given some discussion about whether we should, because we're going to have to get much more into the telemedicine or teleeducation business because of our rather diffuse network of training sites. Maybe we should get into CME and do more CME activities online.
Should the alumni? So as people come in, they do get muted so that there's no feedback on their end.
That's good.
And then they can raise their hand, etc. Once we open up the interactions, they can raise their hand, and then we open their access.
Well, you can show me that. I'll let you take care of that.
Yeah,
I'll just do.
We moderate that.
I'll do my 2 buttons.
Let's make sure that's working. Yeah. Yep, we're all set with that. Remember when I was a child growing up, before the weekend before the term began, there was a tradition to take a deworming.
Yeah?
Eat some chocolate before that. That was the fun part. And then take a dewormer.
Well, and that's relatively new. I mean, this whole effort is really in the last 20 years. I mean, it's not, you know, when I started in the field, you know, I started in the 70s, the cost of some of these drugs were outrageous. It would cost $3 or $4 to cure a person with schistosomiasis, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in developing countries, it's an astronomical number. And, you know, we really didn't start having an impact until we got the cost of the drugs down to pennies.
Increase the access and availability.
Now, there was always drugs that could be used against roundworms, which are things like aspirin. That was, you know, even before albendazole, mebendazole was relatively cheap, and palmawate and a variety of other drugs that were relatively inexpensive. But the drugs required to treat the more serious infections, not only schisto, but lymphatic filariasis, etc., we had to get that cost of that down. And of course, the classic example was ivermectin being given by Merck free for human onchocerciasis. That was really the breakthrough.
We're going to get I'm going to take a drink.
Okay, because it'll be the last one I do without being on stage.
There you go.
Okay.
Welcome to another edition of our One Health, One Medicine seminar series, live from St. George's University at our True Blue campus in Grenada. I trust that the previous month was a very pleasant and productive one for you, and thank you for joining us once again. For those who are new to this course, welcome. And to those of you who have joined us since its inception as part of our 40th anniversary at St. George's University in January, you would have experienced a diversity of topics and presenters as we deliver this course to you. We have had our faculty, our alumni, our students interact on a spectrum of One Health, One Medicine, whether it's physical health, mental health, social health. Today, we're actually very pleased to have our president, Dr. G. Richard Owles, with us today, and he's going to present on one of his own areas as part of his research, his career. He's an expert in the field of tropical medicine, and he's going to present a particularly interesting topic on deworming the world's children. I think it is an ambitious topic, but one that I'm certain we will see the value and possibly even question the applicability of this type of intervention. So without further ado, I'd like to share and introduce to you President Richard Owles to present his topic, Deworming the World's Children. And after his presentation, we also look forward to having a very interesting conversation connected to the topic and possibly how that can interact and apply to your own landscape and where you function, wherever you are in this world as well. So Dr. Owles, thank you for joining our seminar presentation today, and well, we look forward to a very interesting topic and conversation with you.
Well, thank you very much. I think when I start, let me say that, yes, I'm a human physician, an MD, but interestingly, the disease that I've studied most of my professional career is a zoonotic disease. It basically affects animals as well as humans, and therefore, in our striving to control that disease, we basically had to take in all of the classic components of the One World, One Health, and so I think this makes a nice model for this particular seminar. Now, I'm going to be specifically talking about worm infections, and worm infections encompass a fairly large number of diseases of both animals and humans, and I'm going to focus on a particular subset of very common worm infections in the human populations. So let's start first thinking a bit about worms in general. And although Gary Larson seems to think that worms are a pretty simple thing to do, they're actually extremely complex organisms. In contrast to bacteria and viruses and protozoa that are single-celled organisms and relatively simplistic in their structure, worms are actually multicellular organisms. They're very complex living things. They have been designed to do such difficult things as, for instance, live for many years inside the blood system of living things like dog heartworms and human lymphatic filariasis, etc. So they're actually very complex organisms and much different than many other infectious things like bacteria and viruses, etc. So in our thinking about worming and deworming, it's important not to use thought processes related to what do we do with tuberculosis or what do we do with pneumococcal pneumonia. We have to approach the worms in a different way because they're fairly complex. One of the other characteristics of worms is they're really big. It's sort of these are the big game of the microbiological world. You know, a beef tapeworm, for instance, might be 35 feet long, which makes this a rather formidable adversaries. And some of them are so small that you can barely see them with the naked eye. But clearly, worms have been known to cause disease in both animals and humans for many hundreds of years because they are big enough so that they could actually be found by someone dissecting a person who has died from unknown causes. So this is just a visual of what we're talking about. So the tapeworms, for instance, or the worm of guinea worm, these are pretty big things. These are things that can be over a foot, well, actually over a yard long. And on the other hand, within that spectrum are things that are as small as an adult schistosome, which are, you know, really only maybe a centimeter long. all visible with the naked eye, but clearly a great deal of difference in size. Now, interestingly, size doesn't really have much to do with how pathogenic they are. So those really big worms often are not very, they don't cause a lot of disease, and whereas some of the very small ones actually cause the most significant morbidity, mortality in humans. And that has to do with where the worms live, their life cycle, and a variety of other issues that I will briefly touch on. But as you can see just from this characterization, protozoa, bacteria, and viruses are in general too small to be seen with the naked eye. Remember that Van Leeuwenhoek, who saw the first living thing through a microscope, actually saw a Giardia organism, which is a protozoa, which is again a pretty big thing in the spectrum of diseases. And viruses, for instance, can only be seen by electronic microscope, and bacteria can be seen by high-powered light microscopy. So this is not, even though I'm a human doctor, this is not just about humans. So several worm infections affect animals as well as they do humans. We're going to talk a bit about Schistosomiasis, which is the disease I specifically studied. Cysticercosis is another disease that affects animals and humans. Hydatid disease, which is a form of basically worm infections, and trichinosis. Those are all worm infections that affect both animals and humans. Now, many species of animals have their own specific species of worms. So, for instance, we're going to talk a bit about giant roundworms, or Ascaris, and humans have their own human species of that worm, but dogs have a different species from cats, raccoons, other living things. They have adapted themselves very well, these worms, to life within a specific species of mammals often. And interestingly, you can still get disease if you get infected with an animal form. It's just a different disease. So the worms could penetrate into your skin, which is part of their natural life cycle, and discover the wrong host, and they go, whoops, in the wrong host, and they then die in the skin, causing a skin affliction, where if it was in a natural host, it would actually complete the life cycle and cause a different disease. Now, many of you in the veterinary world will have heard of dog heartworms, and it's important to point out that that particular dog-specific disease is very similar to some of the human forms of the same type of worm, such as lymphatic filariasis, onchocerciasis, and they're actually treated with exactly the same drugs. This is a point I will make later. Virtually all drugs that we use in this discussion, and for that matter, all drugs that we use to treat worms and humans, were actually developed by our veterinary colleagues and used effectively for many decades in animals, long before we used them in humans. And finally, worm infections per se have an important impact on the food chain, because the worms themselves basically often live within the body of the host, and they basically steal the nutritional value of the food that we put into that host. So that has an important impact on growing children in Africa, in areas that have marginal nutritional intake of those children. And it's also important in raising animals in the food chain, because the worms are eating much of the nutritional value that could have gone into the animal growing and producing more meat. Obviously, it has a major economic impact. Now, speaking of humans more specifically, the soil-transmitted helminths, and that's a group of worms that basically are transmitted through the soil. People basically pick up those worm infections, often by walking barefoot, and the larvae is able to penetrate directly through unbroken skin. The schistosomes, that's the one I study, those are transmitted by freshwater snails, and again, a larval form of the parasite is in that fresh water and basically is capable of penetrating directly through unbroken skin. Now, there's another class of worms that are important in this category, and those are the ones that are contracted through fecal-oral contamination, meaning the eggs of the worm are passed through the oral cavity, hatch inside the human host, and basically cause those diseases. And all of these diseases together affect several billion people. So worm infections are a very significant group of infections in both animals and humans. Now, this is to give you an idea of what they look like. This is an Ascaris. This is a giant roundworm. This is in a fecal specimen, so this is something that could be, 8 inches to a foot long. They tend to be fairly pale in color, and these worms can be passed out in the stool. That would obviously bring your attention to the fact that you have a worm infection. We generally make the diagnosis not by finding the adult worms, but by finding the eggs of the parasite that get passed out in the very same fecal material. This is a scanning electron micrograph of the jaws of a hookworm. Now, hookworms are not nearly as large as the worm I just showed you, but they have the unfortunate characteristic of that jaw biting onto the intestinal mucosa, particularly in the large intestines, but also in certain other parts of the intestinal tract. And so they actually suck blood, if you will, from the inside of your body, rather than what you would be, more characteristic of mosquitoes or black flies that actually are after a blood meal by biting through the outside of your body. Worms such as hookworm actually attach themselves to the lining of the intestinal tract, and they actually live there for many years, and they can cause a drain of your iron stores because they basically are draining iron by directly using blood and the hemoglobin in your red cells as an energy source. Now, schistosomes are more complex than either of the other two I just told you about. They involve, as I mentioned before, freshwater snails. They are very specific species of freshwater snails, and they live in a symbiotic relationship between animals and in some cases also human beings. What basically happens is the adult worms of this particular parasite live in the blood supply of the human. One species lives in the blood supply of the intestines, a pretty rich place. The blood supply that comes out of the small intestines before it goes through the liver has the richest source of nutrients of any blood source in the body. And so 2 of the 3 species live there. And one of the species actually lives in the blood supply surrounding the urinary bladder. And how they complete their life cycle is they lay thousands of eggs, and the eggs are actually able to penetrate directly through tissue planes by an enzymatic mechanism. So basically, in the intestinal forms of schistosomiasis, the eggs penetrate into the stool where they're passed out to complete the life cycle, and in the urinary form, they're passed through the wall of the bladder and the urinary tract and are passed out in the urine. In any case, when they hit fresh water, those eggs hatch. They then infect specific species of freshwater snails. Several weeks later, those snails begin to shed another form of the parasite, which is able to penetrate skin, unbroken human skin or animal skin, and then complete that life cycle. So a more complex life cycle, much like trying to treat malaria. In addition to treating people with malaria, we often try to kill the mosquitoes. In the same approach, we treat people with this disease, but we also can control the disease by controlling the vector, in this case, freshwater snails. Now, this is the human disease that is caused by schistosomiasis, in this case the form of schistosomiasis that affects the liver and intestines. And basically most of these eggs don't make it out into the stool. Many of them are carried downstream and become lodged in the liver, where they cause a lot of inflammation and ultimately cause fibrosis. And so tragically we see adolescents that are dying the same type of disease that alcoholics would die in their 30s and 40s from cirrhosis of the liver. In this particular case, they die of fibrosis of the liver caused by parasite eggs over a long period of time, causing obstruction of the portal blood flow as it passes through the liver. This young Egyptian boy on the right-hand panel obviously has very severe schistosomiasis. He passed away just a few months after this picture was taken. I have his brother in the same picture because his brother actually is also infected with schistosomiasis, making the point that not every human being suffers exactly the same morbid sequelae of the disease, and a lot of other host factors, nutritional status, when they get infected, how long they're infected, the intensity of infection, all of those things contribute to who gets the most severe disease, who might die from schistosomiasis, and who might live a relatively normal life without too many obvious overt problems. Now, worm infections can cause certain types of disease in humans that is unique to that specific species of worm. So that picture I showed you of schistosomiasis and the unusual type of liver disease that it causes is unique to schistosomiasis. Nothing else causes that problem. And of course, scientists for years focused on that unique form of damage to the liver because you knew when you saw it, it could only be caused by schistosomiasis. And although important and obviously can cause to severe disease and death, it was not the only kind of damage that these worms could cause, but it was the focus of research in this area for many years. The urinary form, by the way, also could lead to obstruction of the urinary tract and ultimately actually to bladder cancer. And in fact, in areas where that species of schistosomiasis were common, such as the Nile Basin, bladder cancer was a very common cause of death in older adults as a result of these years of infection. Now, it was a false assumption that the only morbidity was caused by these worm-specific changes. There's other types of morbidity, but we really didn't know of other types of morbidity until we could effectively treat these diseases. Many of the diseases, including schistosomiasis, was really difficult to treat and involved fairly toxic injectable drugs. And really the first effective non-toxic oral drug for schistosomiasis was not introduced until the 1980s. And that gave us a chance to study other kinds of morbidity caused by the very same worms. It's also true that in the intestinal worms, like Ascaris and hookworm, I showed you a couple of those pictures, many people thought, well, these are fairly innocuous things. There's billions of people that have them, and we don't see any obvious changes in these children that have these infections. So there was a kind of a feeling that, you know, they're not that important from a medical standpoint because they didn't see people dying of the disease or suffering morbid sequelae. But once we could effectively treat them, then that attitude changed a bit. Now, the other thing that affected our thinking in this public health problem was the cost of the drugs. So back in the in the 80s, when many of these drugs were introduced, it could cost $3 or $4 to cure a human of an infection with a specific worm. And that may not seem like a lot of money in today's economy, but if you're talking about most of these individuals come from very poor countries and are the poorest members of society in those poor countries, the cost of $3 or $4 to cure a person only to go back and get reinfected, certainly by the next year, made interventions really not very cost effective in these countries. In fact, that amount of money, let's say $3 or $4 per person, often exceeded the entire cost of health care for that person in that country because of the fairly low standard and the low infrastructure that existed in those countries. Finally, the other thing that really hurt the study of worm infections historically, when people were trying to characterize and prioritize what are the most important infections of humans, the World Health Organization, and actually a professor from Harvard, came up with a way of assessing the impact that diseases have short of dying. Because when you think about it, from a public health standpoint, if a child dies within a few months of childbirth, as tragic as that is, the societal impact of that is relatively small, and that drives actually very high fertility rates, and actually populations continue to grow and expand even though there's a fairly high child morbidity rate. On the other hand, the classic disease, onchocerciasis or river blindness, caused blindness in individuals as they approached their years of being productive members of society when they get into their teenage years and young adulthood. And going blind really cripples a society because, of course, people try to keep their parents alive who have gone blind from this disease. They're not able to function as effectively in a largely rural agrarian economy. And so the classic impact of a disease like onchocerciasis, which didn't kill people but caused a tremendous amount of morbidity, changed our thinking. In fact, a statue of a person with onchocerciasis currently sits outside the World Health Organization's headquarters in Geneva. So they introduced something called disability-adjusted life years, which is a reflection of the impact that these diseases have on human suffering. And because we only thought the diseases caused by worms were only a very small segment of the population that was heavily infected for very long periods of time, the worm infections received relatively little financial support and interest among the public health sector for many decades. Well, interestingly, since we're talking about One Health, the idea of this periodic deworming of children actually came from veterinarians and a long-standing practice that many of you who have pets already employ, which is rather than check to see if your dog has worms, let's just give them a tablet once every 3 or 4 months and kill every worm in their body. These drugs are incredibly safe.
and they, you know, were basically distributed without a prescription, and people who were pet owners basically bought drugs that they periodically gave to their animals, and they made them healthier, and they didn't even have to check to see if they have the disease. Now, when you think about it, that is a pretty interesting approach and had never been used with human beings, although we've been doing it with pets for probably half a decade, or decades. So once we began to treat large human populations with worm infections, we began to discover that those worm infections caused a lot of morbidity that was subtle. Now, what I mean by subtle is it's not so obvious just looking at the individual to say, you know, this person is suffering from a worm infection. And some of those subtle morbidities include things like anemia and growth stunting and decreased cognitive or work performance. And the reason they're hard to put your finger on is so many different things impact those. So clearly, if you have plenty of iron in your diet and you have a reasonably good diet to begin with, basically the impact of the worm infections are clearly going to be a lot less than if you have a worm infection to somebody that's already nutritionally deprived, is already short of iron, and is already living in a marginal health environment. The worm infection is going to have a far greater impact on that individual than an otherwise healthy person that has an excess of nutritional support. So that was a different concept in worm infections. And it also meant that the groups that were susceptible to those types of morbidity were different. So it isn't like everybody with 100 worms in their body are going to suffer the same. We suddenly realized that individuals who already had problems with iron deficiency anemia, already were nutritionally deprived, already were in a marginal segment of their population, are at greater risk to suffer adverse effects from the same intensity of a worm infection than a more affluent person with lots of resources, etc. And so the susceptibility groups changed, having less to do with the parasite or the worm statistics and more to do with the human host that had those worm infections. Now, it also meant that the subtle morbidity dramatically changed this DALY calculation, because if basically every growing child suffered some modest impact on growth and anemia, etc., in developing countries, then suddenly the impact of those worm infections, because they're multiplied by billions, become a huge public health problem and dramatically raised the idea that worm infections now are approaching problems of equal importance to, let's say, nutritional deficiencies, vitamin A deficiency, preventable viral infections from universal childhood immunization. So clearly, this understanding of the impact of worms on these subtle changes in the body dramatically changed our thinking, and that's relatively new. That's probably no more than 2 decades old. And finally, the most important thing, if you actually treat worm infections, these things get better. So even better, we have now a treatment, and if we treat them, they get better. And that really created a tremendous impetus for us to begin doing something about worm infections. Well, these are just some pictures of people that did very careful studies in populations that were chronically exposed to worm infections. This is a biological anthropologist that worked with me who was actually measuring growing children so that we could actually determine the exact impact that these worms had on growing children. Now, this is just an example of a study of the Far Eastern strain of Schistosomiasis that I did myself, which looked at the impact of being infected with the worm versus not being infected with the worm. And as you can see, being infected with this parasite made a pretty significant difference. I mean, almost an 8-centimeter difference in height and almost a 6-kilogram difference in weight in males that were going through that adolescent growth spurt. Basically, that's pretty significant if you're, you know, that much shorter and that much lighter than your cohorts in a largely manual labor agrarian society. Those are pretty significant impacts. In addition, they had less muscle bulk and they had less fat stores as measured by their skin folds. Now, what was also interesting is, well, what happens if you cure them of those infections? Can you improve that situation? And so this is a complicated slide, but let me just try to simplify it. If you had an infection, were successfully treated, and were kept free of infection for a year, compared to a person that was never infected during that same interval, actually they had a faster growth rate. They picked up more weight. They grew faster from height. So they were able to catch up, if you will, if you could cure them of the infections. Unfortunately, this slide also shows you one of the drawbacks. We're doing nothing to prevent them from getting reinfected. So if they weren't infected and then got infected during that interval, clearly their growth, both from a height and weight standpoint, slowed down dramatically. So this increases the emphasis that yes, it's a great idea to treat growing children to keep them, to eliminate the worms, but you got to keep them free of those worms. Otherwise, you continually grow and then slow up and then grow and then slow up. So keeping them free of those infections by a periodic application of deworming drugs is an important goal if we want to improve such things as height and weight. Now, anemia is another really important. In fact, I would say iron deficiency anemia may be among the most important health issues on our planet. And of course, that's because half our world's population, being women, are at risk to develop iron deficiency anemia as a result of menstruation and of childbearing. And so anemia is a very important issue, and anemia is also directly related usually to cognitive performance and functional work capacity and a variety of other things. So the impact that worms have on iron deficiency anemia is a particularly important aspect of this disease. These two hands, the upper one is somebody with a hookworm infection. Remember, those hookworms suck blood as part of their energy source, and the other is the uninfected person of the same age. Now here's an example of, again, a study where we actually treated a population and then not only looked at the impact of growth. I already showed you, obviously, it impacts growth, but we took a look at its impact on hemoglobin. And as you can see, that basically deworming children basically significantly impacted that child's hemoglobin. So that is a very important thing to be doing, particularly for the half of the population that are women, who ultimately will have to deal with iron deficiency anemia in many countries of the world as they go through menarche. Then some of the other things that got the interest of, let's say, the Secretary of Finance or the economic groups is that it turned out that worm infections, when you cure them of worm infections, you can increase their functional work capacity. And now your largely manual workforce could actually do more work as a result of being free of infections. And probably the most powerful impact, which was the most difficult to measure, was deworming children had an impact on their cognitive performance and ultimately had an impact on their school performance. So a lot of good things happen when you can deworm children, particularly in populations that have other nutritional and disadvantages. And therefore, the idea that we should periodically deworm growing children on an international scale became a popular idea now about 2 decades ago. So what are some of the concepts that we want you to remember about this subtle morbidity caused by worms? Well, first of all, almost every person suffers some degree of subtle morbidity. It may be below our ability to detect it, but it probably is not a good idea to have worms. That morbidity is related to human factors now far more than worm factors. Things like they're already malnourished or they're already iron deficient. That treatable worm infections probably cause a huge amount of disability-adjusted life years. So, mass deworming programs on a population basis could have a big impact on the health of the world's population. And treatment of worms will have an indirect effect on other programs. And I'm going to show you some data to do that, especially childhood immunization programs. And if we could basically find a cost-effective way to deliver on a regular basis deworming drugs to the target population, this would be a great impact to increasing maternal mortality, childhood mortality, performance in school, and economic impact of these populations, all of which would be put deworming in the same category as things like breastfeeding programs and childhood immunizations. Now, one of these indirect effects that you may not have thought of requires us to give you a little premise on immunology. So our body's immune response tends to move along in a continuum, and basically certain types of immune responses, I'm going to refer to these as Th1 responses, are necessary, for instance, in response to viral infections and bacterial infections, and are used in our own immune responses to vaccines. And Th2 responses are an interesting type of immune response that is much more characteristic in worm infections. So worms tend to push our body's immune response to any introduced antigen in one direction that actually makes them less susceptible to morbidity caused by worms, but it also makes them less effective to use, let's say, childhood vaccinations. So one of the things that was learned early on is that deworming children and then waiting a few months, the body's immune system moves back toward the type of immune response which is required to have an effective response to vaccines. So the combination of deworming children and then following up a few months after their body's immune systems adjusted to having lost the worms is an effective strategy to have more impact of vaccines such as tetanus toxoid or DPT or other vaccines that require Th1 response. So I just went through those points. Worms cause a Th2 dominance. They interfere with the Th1 response to new antigens or infections. And so the effectiveness of BCG, a vaccine against tuberculosis, DPT against pertussis and diphtheria, and hepatitis B vaccines means that if we time our deworming programs effectively, we can have an impact on a bunch of other diseases. In addition, there are certain natural infections common in these same countries, like hepatitis B and C and HIV, etc., which clearly alters the body's immune system as well. And so understanding the impact that worms have on the immune system is important to understand how we might manage other illnesses that are not worms. Finally, the treatment. Now, I mentioned that the treatment of worm infections basically were all developed by veterinarians and were found to be highly effective in animals, and only late did they become available for human use. And so basically all the soil transmitted and the fecal oral transmitted worm infections can be treated with albendazole and mebendazole, which are two drugs that are commonly used in veterinary medicine. And all species of schistosomiasis can be effectively treated with a drug called praziquantel. Now, the price of these drugs, though, became rate-limiting steps, but we also needed to make sure that these were safe to use in humans, and because we were going to use a cocktail of drugs, meaning using 2 or 3 different drugs to be sure that we killed all the worms that were in that person's body, we had to conduct very careful double-blind placebo-controlled studies, and this is one, actually the first one, that was done under the auspices of the World Health Organization by a group, including myself, that studied this in 4 countries of the world in children basically infected with both schistosomes and soil-transmitted helminths. And the end result of that was that the side effects were very minimal. In fact, they were mostly related to the killing of the worms themselves, not to any toxic effects of the drugs. In fact, those side effects were so minor that just as we experienced in the veterinary world, where basically pet owners can buy the drugs and give it to their dogs themselves, we could actually deliver these drugs through non-health professionals. We could actually use school teachers and other programs to deliver these drugs because they were very safe and effective. And we had to do a very careful blinded study to be sure that was the case. Also, an unexpected benefit of this is that in the course of that double-blind study, we actually treated a fair number of individuals that were living in areas of the world that were endemic for these diseases, but we didn't think they were infected. Now, it turns out they probably were infected, but their infection was so light that it was below the detection rate of our standard tests, usually a single stool exam. And interestingly, their anemia got better too, suggesting that even the treatment of very light infections can have a positive impact on children. And if we had directed therapy only to those children that we had tested positive for the worms, we would have missed all those children, and they could have had a benefit from treatment. Now, whenever you talk about using drugs on a population over a long period of time, you have to worry a bit about the development of drug resistance. And so we've looked very carefully at the development of drug resistance with these medications. And here we can take advantage of the fact that they often have been used for years and years with animals to find out if that's really a realistic risk or not. Now, animal studies have shown that Ascaris, that's giant roundworm, there's a species of Ascaris from both pigs and cows, that if you treat them too frequently with these drugs, those worms will get resistant to those drugs. So the key there is don't treat people too frequently. Let's not be treating them every month, because that will just drive the development of resistance, which happened in animal studies. Instead, you want to treat them enough to keep that burden low, but not so frequently as to drive resistance. So the timing's important. Now, in the case of the schistosomes and praziquantel, we actually have areas of the world like the Nile Delta that have been treated for decades. And fortunately, the schistosomes there that appear to be somewhat resistant to the drug are less efficient and are less healthy, if you will, worms. And so far, there's really no profound evidence that there is resistance developing against this drug, even though we've been using it for about 40 to 50 years now. Probably the most important thing from a public health standpoint is these drugs that used to cost $3 or $4 each. The combined effects of the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, a variety of other groups, we have the cost of treating these now down to literally pennies. So now it costs about 9 cents to treat a person with schistosomiasis and about 3 cents to treat a person with soil-transmitted helminths, which is very manageable in countries with these limited economic backgrounds. So starting in about 2001, we basically tried to roll this out on an international basis, basically periodically deworming all school-age children in countries endemic for these parasites, and administer them through the primary school system, which had the advantage of using the teachers, so we didn't have to separately employ a bunch of healthcare professionals, and we could basically deliver the medications to others that weren't actually in school, but were siblings of those that were in school. So the school is a very good framework for which to deliver population-based drugs. Now, who's going to pay for this? Well, again, this was an interesting partnership. Basically, the developed world basically provided the drugs for free, but the developing countries basically covered all the labor costs for distributing the drugs and managing the systems, because they had a labor source that was internal, didn't have to spend foreign capital on. And so that was a very nice trade-off. We'll give you the drugs for free, and you figure out a way to effectively distribute them to the people that need them, and the overall cost then is really quite low. And we developed basically tens of millions of dollars to basically deliver on that plan. Now, there were some obstacles that were in our way. It turns out that there's a tremendous gender bias in attending schools in many countries in the developing world. Egypt, for example, a country that I work in, there's an equal number of boys and girls that are born in Egypt, so there's not a gender bias there. But, by the 5th grade, only about 20% of the students in the 5th grade are women, and 80% are men. So you have to be careful that if we only treated those that were attending school, we would clearly leave large segments of the population out. So we can use the school as the center for the treatment programs, but we don't want to only treat those that are actually in attendance in school, because we miss many of the people that need that treatment most. And so, interestingly, children probably at the highest risk to suffer the morbid sequelae, if you're following my logic, are actually the ones that aren't attending school. They're the ones that are most marginal in the society. They're the ones that are hardest to get to. So clearly, we don't want to leave them out. And then, interestingly, you wouldn't have thought this was a problem, but praziquantel is delivered by weight. You have to basically weigh the individual to determine how many pills they get. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but that scale completely blew the budgets of control programs, because the scale was not only expensive, but it had value besides the treatment programs, because scales could be used to measure rice, they could be used in stores for other things. And so buying a scale that might cost, even at a deep discount, for $20, they wouldn't last in a community very long, because people would use the scale for other things. So that scale issue turned out to be potentially the Achilles heel of this entire plan. So in 2002, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with the Imperial College in England, began to develop if you will, a practical way of implementing this kind of approach throughout Africa, which is one of the countries, obviously, for which these types of interventions would be most effective. And they tried to basically figure out ways to, in a practical way, to introduce this approach on a broad scale. One of the cleverest things that they did, and when you think about it, sometimes the simplest things turn out to be the most effective, is they converted the weight-based dosing of this drug into a height-based dosing of the drug. And so now, instead of having to buy an expensive scale, they could give you a little cardboard ruler. You could put it up the side of the schoolhouse, and basically a student could stand next to it, and it would say 1 pill, 2 pills, 3 pills. So we were able to dose the praziquantel based on height and completely eliminated that cost factor as it related to scales. Did require a lot of scientific work to revalidate in the African setting dosing schedules as it pertained to height. But that scientific work saved this concept as an implementation plan. Now, the ministers of health of various African countries were then started pilot programs, and over really, from about 2002 to about 2012, basically we continue to increase the number of school children that were getting periodic treatment. And basically, by about 2006 and 2007, we were treating on an annual basis about 40 million children, largely in Africa, with this approach. And the impact was measurable. This is from Uganda, looking at basically infections with both a schistosome, in this case Schistosoma mansoni, and hookworm, again one of those soil-transmitted helminths. And as you can see, the periodic application of these drugs resulted in a decrease in the prevalence of those two infections over time. It didn't all happen in the first year, but by doing it on an annual basis, we were able to beat down those infections fairly significantly. And when you look at what impact it was having on subtle morbidity, clearly over time we were reducing the prevalence of anemia in those same populations, which has lots of secondary benefits, as we know from our earlier discussion. And finally, the hemoglobin levels, which is the inverse of anemia, were increasing over that same period of time. So deworming on a periodic basis was decreasing the prevalence of the infection, but more importantly, it was having a positive impact on at least one measurable outcome, which was iron deficiency anemia. Now, we had a particular problem with pregnant women that was, again, one of these unexpected stumbling blocks in this approach. And basically, worm-infected pregnant women are more anemic, and they tend to have more miscarriage. And they tend to have smaller birth weight children. So you would think, well, this is slam junk. Let's do something about that. But interestingly, one of the problems is that women are pregnant and lactating for a very long period of time. This is a study I did in the Philippines to just show you that in a high fertility area like the Philippines, that once a woman goes through menarche, the odds of her being pregnant or lactating is very high, and we would miss, probably 40 to 50% of the female population if we didn't treat when they were pregnant or lactating, which was what the standard of care was at that time. So why did that take place? Well, when these drugs, which were veterinary drugs, were released to the human population, no one wanted to spend the money to prove it was safe in small children under 2 or in pregnant women. And so the drugs worked, but we released them to the population. And if you pick up today, a drug textbook in the United States, they would all say that these are drugs which have never been tested in pregnant or lactating women. And ministers of health of developing countries said, oh, well, we don't want to do anything bad to these pregnant women, so we're just not going to treat them. The problem with that logic is the worms are really bad for these pregnant and lactating women, and so we needed a more careful assessment of whether it was better to not give them the drugs and therefore avoid any possibility of an adverse effect of the drug versus curing them of their infection, and obviously that would have a benefit not only on the woman but on an unborn child. So finally, after a lot of hard work, a double-blind placebo-controlled trial was done. That was done by my colleagues in the Philippines and another one in Africa. And basically, the result was what we expected, which is basically that it's better to treat these women and cure them of their infection than to withhold treatment, which would force them to suffer the ill effects, not only as the women themselves, but their unborn children. So a second problem was, again, for financial reasons, these drug companies that already developed the drugs for veterinary use didn't want to spend the time and energy to basically prove they were safe in children under 2. But unfortunately, there are a fair number of children under 2 that have worm infections, and they're the very group, because they're so young and they're growing so rapidly, that probably suffer ill effects. So again, we had to spend a fair amount of work in developing an a non-pill formulation to treat children, basically a liquid form, and to prove that they're safe and effective in order for us to institute basically universal treatment of all populations at risk for these infections. So that solution basically is, now that we have done those studies, we still have to put pressure on countries to basically adopt the approach of treating all people that are infected, whether they're pregnant women or their children under 2. We do need to probably do some continued studies on those children under 2 to make sure that those are still safe. We actually have the dose pole for children now. Instead of using something they'd stand next to, it would be like a tape measure. And finally, we need to get pediatric suspensions more readily available. And finally, the point I make with women, not only do women need to be included in these studies, they should be the targets of the studies. Because of that iron deficiency anemia issue, actually treating the women, in my opinion, is far more important than treating the men, who are far less likely to develop iron deficiency anemia in adulthood. But unfortunately, we still haven't solved this problem. I'd like to say, well, you know, we've sort of conquered this, we can move on now. But basically, this decade, only about 13% of the children at risk worldwide have been reached by these international deworming programs. And the worldwide recession and a change in the political environment that we're all experiencing now has drained resources from international aid groups, and we are not making tremendous progress in treating a larger segment of the at-risk population. And we need a plan to have more bang for our buck, or we're just not going to do better than what we're doing today. So that plan is to incorporate what I've just discussed, deworming children largely for schistosomes and soil-transmitted helminths, into a larger strategy to combat a whole host of neglected tropical diseases. Now, why do we even use that term? It's because over the last 2 decades, there's been a fair amount of emphasis on AIDS, on tuberculosis, and on malaria. Appropriately, those are really big problems, and we have international efforts to address all those issues. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other diseases that people in these countries suffer from, and they basically were given a much lower priority with all the money going to those 3 big diseases. And so those groups sat down and tried to think, what could we do together that would improve the treatment of these up till now largely neglected diseases? And one is to recognize that many of them are currently treated with the periodic application of a drug. And so basically we thought of combining the efforts to control African Trichinosis, trachoma, leprosy, Schistosomiasis, onchocerciasis, lymphatic filariasis, a variety of other drugs, all of which required periodic chemotherapy. And let's figure out how we could work together to basically determine in a geographic area within a country, or in countries per se, what would be the combination of medicines that we would deliver on an annual basis that would have the net effect of impacting multiple diseases endemic in those communities. And that's exactly the effort that we have today. And so combining all of these strategies into a single drug periodic treatment strategy for neglected tropical diseases is now what we are currently organizing to do. And that allows drug procurement and the supply and demand to be centralized, not just these 2 or 3 anti-worm drugs, but a bunch of other drugs that we would use on a periodic basis. We can make them essential national drugs, drive down the cost by making deals, if you will, with drug companies to produce them at very low cost for use in developing countries. And today, there really are 4 priority diseases: HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, and I'm glad to say the neglected tropical diseases. So that's my presentation. I hope that that stimulates some interest there in the audience, and I'd be glad to take some questions both about my presentation and about the public health interventions that it relates to.
Thank you, President Oles. As I worm my way back into the scene, very interesting in several folds. Well, first of all, I believe your presentation sort of specifically highlights the inextricable link in health between that of humans, animals, and the environment, but also brings forward an issue that has global relevance and significance, and one that has at hand a solution, which requires the necessary effort for it, but certainly it can lead to another success for global health, for public health in our current time and perspective as well. So thank you very much for that presentation.
Well, and one thing I'd point out, a lot of the discussion in One Health is how do we get veterinarians to work with physicians to get with public health workers. That's classic.
Yeah.
But I hope if you understood at the end, we also, within those worlds, can't always be just advocating for our disease, which has been part of the thing. That, in a sense, we have to get beyond that, beyond human medicine, animal medicine, public health, and start thinking together about what's the best way to approach the health of everyone by combining the strengths of various efforts into a consolidated effort. And we have a long way to go on that because we're not so great at working with everyone. But that's probably the single most important thing to do, in my opinion, in the One Health initiative, is find ways for everyone, education ministers, agricultural ministers, finance ministers, ministers of health, to work together to basically improve the well-being of all living things on this planet.
In one of your studies, for example, you work with an anthropologist.
Yes.
In terms of implementing these treatment programs as well.
Right.
So it definitely shows how we need to consider One Health beyond the traditional paradigm of the medicines, and certainly consider other options and other skill sets and competencies as well as we tackle these global health burdens that we're faced with. Well, as part of today's session, we would certainly like to hope that you enjoyed your lunch. In fact, you had lunch during this presentation. But beyond that, to interact with Dr. Oles on the topic, whether it's his presentation, but also on a conversation on One Health, One Medicine. And while we wait for your comments, your questions, whether it's on the chat box or through audio, Dr. Oles, as president of St. George's University, can you share with us your vision, your expectations, your interests in how we as an institution can go forward with this One Health, One Medicine approach?
Well, I've only been president of St. George's for 2 years, so prior to that, I actually was the founding dean of a U.S. medical school, and prior to that, I was chairman of the Department of Medicine in 2 other U.S. medical schools. But interestingly, I've also taught in veterinary schools because I'm obviously a parasitologist. And I will say one of the characteristics of many of the U.S. medical schools is there's very little interaction between their medical schools, their veterinary schools, and their public health schools. In fact, sometimes that gulf is quite wide, even within the university. So I would say one of the great advantages that we have at St. George's is we have a medical school, we have a veterinary school, we have a nursing school, we have an active school of arts and sciences, we have a graduate school that gives a public health degree, a business degree, a master's of psychology degree, and we're all here on one campus in a small country that could really benefit from our combined efforts to work together. So it's not only an ideal laboratory from an academic standpoint, we're all here together, working together on this little island, but we also have an island that we are work very effectively with, where we can, in a sense, take on a whole island and say, hey, what could we do together to improve the health of every living thing on the island? Yeah. And so that's unique. I don't see that in many other universities of the world. And I think we're in an unusual position, and we are, by definition, a very international school. So I don't think there's a better place in the world, probably, to begin making progress around these concepts than here at St. George's University.
Sounds like a plan for us.
It is our plan.
Yeah.
So, Satish, we do have a few questions coming up. When you guys are ready, let me know.
Please feel free to share the questions, whether it's on the chat box or in the audio as well.
So if you're interested in making a question, please just raise your hand and I will indicate when you can turn on your audio. If you do not have a mic, type your question into the chat box. So Frederick had a comment. Frederick, can you go ahead and unmute your mic?
Hi, Frederick.
Good afternoon. I don't think we're not getting the question.
So I'll go ahead and read his question. Okay, it was basically a comment where he said that I've heard that some countries use worms to help cure allergies.
Yes, that you remember when I showed you the slide where they have the Th1 and Th2 responses, and what I was talking about is the worms clearly push the body's immune response in the direction of the Th2 responses. Now that's a bad thing if you want to immunize somebody, because that requires a Th1 response. But you might argue that allergic reactions, asthma, and other things, that same effect might actually have a beneficial effect on people that have certain autoimmune diseases or exaggerated immune response diseases by damping down or decreasing those types of responses. And this is often referred to as worm therapy, and they have discussed using a worm infection that is about as innocuous as worm infections go. And if you were listening to my lecture, I would say most worm infections are not completely innocuous. But something like whipworm, which is a relatively innocuous worm infection, has been suggested that in light infections of individuals that have these types of autoimmune and allergic and asthmatic and other conditions might be a benefit. Now, having said that, I think that at the moment there's relatively little hard evidence, and this is an area for which we better be doing careful double-blind placebo-controlled trials, because before we start giving people infections, I'd really like to have some hard evidence that it actually improves the situation. But theoretically, that would work. It's just that I don't think we're at the point now where I would advocate doing that without much more careful study. Notice the very careful studies that were done in this deworming area to build a case for an international intervention. And I think before we as physicians begin advocating giving worm infections to people for their asthma, I think we need a little more evidence. So, but a good question, by the way.
So Tremaine also has another question. Well, he said, first of all, thank you for the presentation. And the question is, can you become resistant to Zental? And does antibacterial soap like Dial help reduce the transmission of diseases?
Well, it's always theoretically possible to develop resistance to any intervention that we do in the microbiology, microbiome, if you will. And remember that it's not we, the humans, so much as, if you will, the parasites, the bacteria, the viruses of our world are tremendous survivors. They have had to live for millions of years, and they adapt very well to whatever we do. So we should always be aware of the fact that through mutation, through other adaptations, all living things can find ways of getting around whatever clever thing we do. Now, having said that, if you're talking specifically around hand washing and other activities, I think there's very solid evidence that hand washing is very important in a health care environment to keep the healthcare providers, like doctors and nurses, etc., from transmitting potentially disease-causing bacteria, particularly, but occasionally viruses in other settings from person to person. So I think hand washing is a very critical thing for us to do in the healthcare environment. Now, is there evidence that hand washing is important in the non-healthcare environment? Well, the best evidence for that clearly is in the food industry. And there's no doubt that we have solid evidence that washing hands is important in the safety and hygiene in proper food safety. And we at St. George's, in fact, have recently put a lot more emphasis on those types of things around our vendor foods, etc., because there's very strong evidence that hand washing is very important from a public health standpoint around the ingestion of food, etc. Now, what is the evidence that repeated hand washing, etc., in other settings is beneficial? It's not as strong, but I would say there's relatively little downside to washing your hands, and that many of the antibacterial soaps and preparations have mechanisms of action that would be difficult for bacteria and parasites to basically get around. And so I'm not as concerned as I would, let's say, with antibiotics that are taken internally and for which bacteria have pretty clear mechanisms to develop resistance. I'm not as worried that many of the topical preparations that we use today will be ineffective in the future because we, quote, use them too much. I think there's little downside and a big upside from vigorous hand washing, and we all should encourage more of that than we do today.
And just to expand on your note on the food industry and its role as well in this burden of parasitic diseases as well as worms, when we think about issues like meat hygiene and food quality, where a lot of these parasites are sourced from a perspective of the environment, we have to think about how we can promote and advocate for controlled at the level of the animal population, but also at the level of the processing point of view,
Sure.
whether it's at the slaughterhouses, the abattoirs, the ability for public health officers, environmental health officers, veterinarians to actually serve as filters and mitigators towards preventing the exposure of these parasites onto the human population as well.
Sure. In countries, for instance, endemic for Schistosomiasis, that's a cestode infection that is also causes pig tapeworm.
Yeah.
Most of the cases of Schistosomiasis, the individual that transmits that particular parasite are the food handlers, the mother usually transmitting it to their children. The mother actually has the tapeworm, and because she doesn't wash her hands or have the best hygienic standards, as she prepares the food, it actually puts her children at risk to develop Schistosomiasis. So the interaction between animals, especially as a food source, and humans and food preparation techniques, we know is tightly connected to outbreaks of disease. I mean, salmonella in the preparation of of chicken, and all of these things that people talk about as proper handling techniques when we're dealing with animal food sources that have a high likelihood of being contaminated with salmonella are really important. And we're going to continue to have outbreaks of those diseases if we can't find public health interventions that work.
So thank you very much for that answer. Corey asked, has there been any preliminary studies on the efficacy on this widespread treatment for all neglected tropical diseases?
There is, on the standpoint of individual diseases within that group, but I am unaware of a country-wide study, for instance, in places where this has been widely implemented. Now, this is a relatively new intervention, so if you look, I'm showing you data that was created in 2002 through 2006. You have to build into these interventions careful studies in order for you to make conclusions later on. And I think that the approach to the neglected tropical diseases, we are beginning to get some studies out on the impact that that has, but not yet. I think probably the more compelling data will come out in several more years. But particularly in countries that are endemic for 7 or 8 of these diseases, I believe that you will, that if we study it carefully during the intervention phase, we will find positive evidence. Let me also point out something. None of you asked this question, but there was a Cochrane study that showed that deworming children, was not all that effective in improving their health. But that Cochrane study was all done now in an era for which widespread use of these drugs and treatment has now become mainstay. The time to do these studies is when the prevalence is high and when you're first making the intervention. Because once you, if you will, intervene in the population, it will become increasingly difficult to determine a positive impact between, if you will, your treatment group and non-treatment group, because everyone you're studying has been treated. And so, there are those compounding features. Plus, there's a lot of studies that are done that lack sufficient power to find what might be a very small difference. And I've also pointed out, I hope you got the point, there are certain segments of the population that are at highest risk to get the morbidity. So if you do a population, if you don't segregate who you're studying and study everyone, maybe 85 or 90% of the people you're studying will have, relatively little impact of treatment. But what you're really worried about is the 10% that will have a big impact. And if you don't study it that way, if the design of your study is not that way, you'll never find it.
So Andrew asked, is it more effective to deal with deworming or prevention of infections?
Well, hopefully this is not either or. I mean, you got to do all of these things. So nothing that I said about deworming programs would suggest that we should decrease at all public health interventions. In fact, they actually tend to be synergistic. When you're deworming children in an African village, that's an opportunity. First of all, you need to explain to people in the village why you're doing it. And that is a great opportunity to explain how these diseases are acquired, what are some of the local things that you could do to help mitigate against those diseases, what are some other things that you do as a community that will decrease the prevalence of other diseases besides the worm infections. So, for instance, the benefit of having a borehole and a clean source of water. Yeah, that would be a good thing to do, it will have positive impacts on a lot of things, not just the the diseases from that you're doing from deworming. So no, these are not only are they not mutually exclusive, but they should be done in a synergistic way. Populations need to be informed of why you're doing these things, or they're not sustainable, and that they need to know what things they can do to contribute as a community. Really, the empowerment of the community and empower of the people in the community in the process is the key for the success. In fact, that's one of the real geniuses of having school-based programs, because it's really tough for people to say no to a 5th grader that's going around saying, my school project is to make sure that all the children in my village get dewormed. It would be a lot easier for them to say no to me, but it's really tough to say no to the 5th grader from next door. So involvement of the community in the interventions, getting their buy-in, is not only good for your intervention, but it'll help you in a lot of other public health ways as well.
So Frederick asked, is there a possibility of tag-on therapy for other illnesses afflicting certain populations, such as possible hepatitis C treatment in schools at the same time as Helminth treatment?
Well, there are opportunities to do tag-on things. So for instance, many of the deworming programs that we have are now done in conjunction with maternal child health interventions, etc. So those would all lend themselves to working together. Now, in the case of hepatitis C, that would be a fairly tough tag-on, because first of all, the drugs that are used for hepatitis C are orders of magnitude more expensive than what we're talking about, and there is a fair amount of testing, needle sticks and other things, that the complexity of even contemplating taking on a hepatitis C intervention strategy in a developing country are quite a bit different than what we're talking about. Now, on the other hand, let's take that's a real challenge, Hep C. Let's take something like hepatitis B, for which there is a vaccine that's more readily available. It's a vaccination program, and for which we know that we're talking about having an intervention in an age group for which hepatitis B vaccination would be a good time to do it. That would have a lot more synergism than, for instance, a hepatitis C intervention, which is now largely treating people who are identified as having hepatitis C and have had probably that infection, are largely adults. And the cost, logistics, and other support, it's just like HIV. HIV, is a very difficult intervention in these countries. We're doing it, but HIV is in a different population. These are still fairly expensive drugs. Compliance, just to give you an example, deworming children, they take a couple pills once a year. In HIV, if you don't deliver 30 out of 31 days of those antiretroviral drugs, it's not effective. So those are much more complex diseases that go on. So in general, yes, tag-on interventions are a great idea. I just wouldn't have picked hepatitis C as the example. That's a really tough one.
So another question from Frederick was, can snails be treated for schistosomiasis?
Yeah, they actually kill the snails. That has been an approach that was done historically. Now, many of us who don't know much about snails would say, hey, what's the big deal? You just kill the snails. It turns out that freshwater snails have tremendous biological potential. So let me give you an example. If you have an irrigation canal in Egypt that's infested with the freshwater snail vector of that disease, and you kill 99.99% of the snails with a mollusciciding agent, you come back 3 months later, there's exactly the same number of snails. They have tremendous biological potential. The other problem with killing the snails is that very drug that we use to kill the snails kill all the fish and other things in the same canal. So it's a little like the DDT story. There's a lot of downside to killing the mosquitoes in that approach, and so that's one of the reasons in mosquito-transmitted diseases we're trying to use different approaches to vector control. And I think the same thing is true with snails. Right now, the best we've got has a lot of problems. It kills the snails, but they come back very quickly, and the drugs are pretty toxic to the environment. So I would say in general, schistosomiasis control programs have not focused on killing snails very much. There are some exceptions. There may be a specific location where there's a lot of transmission, where women are washing their clothes and doing this, for which periodic application of molluscicides, which are anti-snail medication of the water, might be used. But in general, this is not an approach that can be done on a worldwide basis.
And we've also had experiences from an environmental management perspective where creating dams, for example, flooding a valley, will expose snails to the environment, and people who actually are exposed to that water, they can allow for the life cycle of the parasite to be completed in the human host as well. So we also be very mindful about how we recognize the presence of these vectors in the environment and how best to try to avoid them as well at the same time.
Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, actually, the incidence of schistosomiasis has gone up because the first thing you do in a developing country is you develop the water resources, and that increases the habitat of the snails. And so we have a lot of bad examples in the Blue Nile irrigation project in Sudan, in West Africa, where we did that. And of course, the classic example is the high dam on Lake Nasser in Egypt, where we created a huge schistosomiasis transmission area by damming the Nile and creating an ideal habitat for the disease. They're all related. That's part of our philosophy. Is whatever you do will have an impact on health.
So Corey asked another question. You mentioned drug resistance. Have strategies been put in place so that there's a minimal risk of the development of drug resistance? And if not, how would you approach this problem if drug resistance becomes prevalent?
Well, first of all, there's several approaches. First of all, in areas where we are using, if you will, periodic deworming, there are active surveillance programs to look for the emergence of resistance. So that's an important part of the public health strategy. In fact, when we approach countries, they often want to spend 100% of their money on just doing what they think is a good thing, and we try to dissuade them from that idea. They need a small percentage of whatever funds they've set aside for any program to monitor the program, and part of the monitoring of the program is to look for resistance, and part of the monitoring of the program is also to look for decreased compliance in those populations. So it's very important that no matter how poor a country is, that they understand that monitoring what they do is very important, so they don't end up wasting resources on a strategy that isn't working anymore, because that requires a small investment in, if you will, in monitoring. And so we are currently monitoring these efforts. The other thing it's important to do is that the time to look for alternative drugs in this type of intervention is now, because the time required to develop new drugs against these diseases is now, because it could take decades to develop alternative disease drugs. If we didn't learn this from, chloroquine and malaria, I don't know when we're going to learn that. We basically went to attack one of the great killers of mankind with DDT and chloroquine, and we lost that war within a decade because the mosquitoes and the environment couldn't tolerate it, but the mosquitoes became resistant to DDT, and the malaria parasite became resistant to chloroquine. So we need to also, in prioritization of where our research takes place, let's not stop working on developing antiparasitic drugs because we say, hey, we got great drugs, they're really cheap, we don't have to worry about it. No one should listen to my lecture and take home from that we should stop working on these diseases. We have to keep working on these diseases so that when things like drug resistance develops, we've got an alternative. In the case of the schistosomiasis, really we don't have an alternative. So this would be a particularly important area to continue research on in case we don't expect drug resistance to develop. And we've been using it for 40 or 50 years without a problem, but we would be foolish not to be looking for new drugs, just as we're foolish to not look for new antibiotics, because clearly bacteria are developing resistance to the ones we got.
Yeah. And even from the veterinary side, using mass treatments, several of these drugs that sort of traverse the species in terms of efficacy, we have to be very mindful about regulated and controlled use of these drugs in animal populations as well.
Right. The inappropriate use of antibiotics in food chain animals has clearly accelerated development of drug resistance for human infections. So that's a classic example of where we have to worry on One Health, is that we cannot afford to indiscriminately use any of these agents because the impact is far greater than just the impact in one small area.
Exactly.
Just a reminder to the audience, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, raise your hand and I will call on you to unmute your mic. If you do not have a mic, type your question into the chat and I will read it out. So Alfred has a question, and it is, what would be the impact of climate change on the control of these parasites?
Well, whenever you change the environment, Mother Nature will come up with a new problem. So it's not necessarily completely predictable, but let me point out that in areas of desertification and decreasing rainfall, we're going to become increasingly dependent on managing our fresh water. And so, as you can imagine, since I just told you about Schistosomiasis, this will likely create new habitat and without thinking about what we're doing. So we've already experienced this, for instance, on the island of Grenada. You know, Grenada's climate is changing. The vectors on this island are changing. And as a result of that, we are likely to develop new health issues that we did not anticipate because of climate change. So I think we should be wise. Mother Nature is a very powerful force. We cannot always predict what will happen. I think there's no doubt that climate change is real and that the climate is changing. How it will impact specific diseases, we can guess at, but the truth is, what we're probably best at doing is monitoring the impact of these changes carefully so that we can begin to develop new approaches to the disease as soon as they become problems. I don't think we're going to be very good at guessing exactly how they'll change. Instead, I think we ought to probably be monitoring carefully the impact of those changes and making alterations in our approach as the environment clearly changes.
I would like to just maybe touch on this topic of being a neglected tropical disease. What qualifies a disease to be in that category, and also why are they neglected? Because the burdens that we're speaking about refers to school children's health, their school performances, their functionality in society, developmentally as well. Why are these diseases neglected, and what will it take for them not to be neglected?
Well, you're asking now a fairly tricky political
yes.
and sociological problem. So, and you know, for those of us that have spent most of my professional career working on diseases of poor people in poor country, I do understand what you're saying. But you know, I think if we were objective about it, is the interest of the world in malaria because we care about the 1 million children that die of malaria every year in Africa? Or is our interest in malaria that during the Vietnam War, the United States, a third of our troops had malaria, a third of our troops recovered from malaria, and a third of our troops were fighting the war? Is our interest in malaria because of, if you will, first world interest in these diseases because it has an impact on what they want to do? Or is that interest generated principally by the fact that, that people are concerned about millions of African children dying in malaria? The cynic in me would say that the reason that billions of, not maybe billions, but certainly hundreds of millions of dollars were spent on malaria research in part was driven by other reasons besides what's in the best interest of the world. I would say that there have been, however, some examples of things happening for monetary reasons that turned out pretty good for this effort. I'll point to the deal, if you will, with Merck. Merck basically had the patent on ivermectin, and ivermectin is a multi-billion-dollar industry for Merck, largely from veterinary use, because we use it not only for dogs to prevent heartworm, those of you that have pets, but it's actually used with horses extensively and other large animals, and so that market is really important to Merck. Now, the market of the world's population that is exposed to Schistosomiasis was relatively small. The total at-risk population was probably 40 million. And so for Merck to give the drug free to be used in human use, for which the drug was very inexpensive to perform, was not only a great humanitarian thing, but interestingly it also decreased the likelihood that a country, let's say like Brazil, that actually developed some of its own drugs despite patent laws for local consumption, it destroyed any likelihood that somebody's going to develop ivermectin as a generic, and it fled back and erode their market share. So you know, it's possible to you just have to recognize the motives, but try to figure out ways that you can work it to your advantage. And ivermectin's a great story. Everybody wins on that. And on the other hand, the focus on malaria, TB, and HIV, notice that all three of those, yeah, huge problems in the developing world, but those are all three diseases that are big problems for us and the developed world. Now, what makes them neglected? Well, one of the things is that we don't have a lot of schistosomiasis in the United States. We don't have a problem with hookworm. We used to, by the way. The Rockefeller Foundation, back in the 1900s, identified that in the southern part of the United States, that there was a lot of iron deficiency anemia among the poor children in southern United States because they were walking barefoot and developing, you know, hookworm. And they actually, the Rockefeller Foundation started with a very successful campaign for which they didn't use drugs, by the way. They just distributed the little flip-flop sandals and stuff, and so they made public health interventions. So there is less interest in the developing world in diseases that they don't have, and even less in diseases that they can't get when they're going to tourist places, etc. So as a result of that, there turns out to be less money available for doing this, and so they become neglected because on the priority list, you know, it's not just that the World Health Organization prioritizes it. Ultimately, it's all about who gives the money to actually do the interventions. So, you know, thank God for the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation, a private philanthropic foundation in the United States, gives considerably more resources to this field than the whole World Health Organization does, because, you know, countries like our own don't pay our dues to the World Health Organization, and so they don't have the resources that they need to prioritize diseases based on what's best for mankind. We still live in a world for which, you know, people are concerned with their own problems and not what the world's problems. I wish it wasn't so, but I suppose I don't need to remind anybody on this call. Just look at the current political environment, for which increasingly we are isolating ourselves. It's what's best for us. We don't really care what's best for other people. This is not a great environment to be taking on the big problems of mankind. And so those of us that care about diseases like these, and these neglected tropical diseases, better find very smart and clever ways of approaching them, because I don't anticipate a lot of resources in the near future going into these kind of problems.
And the difficulty with tropical diseases was that they're no longer being confined to tropical environments anymore.
Sure.
Movements of people, animals, products, environmental changes. Any disease in any part of the world can be anybody's business.
Right. And it's going the other way. Recognize that one of the big changes in my professional life is that diseases that were common in the United States, based on our own industrialization, et cetera, are now also very common in developing countries. And so, you know, in Grenada, you know, diabetes is probably the #1 problem, and you know, heart disease and hypertension and diabetes and cancer and a variety of illnesses that are predominantly the scourge of developed countries are now burdening developing countries, and they haven't solved all of the traditional diseases. So they're in a very tough environment, and so you know, the only way to solve these problems is to get away from this them and us and etc. Listen, there is no health problem on this planet that doesn't turn out to be everybody's health problem. And if you doubt that, look at HIV/AIDS. Jesus, if we dealt with that when it was a disease of, you know, that made the species jump from the lesser chimpanzee to man, and dealt with it then, we wouldn't have a worldwide problem. But we didn't deal with it until it was, you know, that genie was out of the bottle. We have a lot of problems that we can see now. Look, the Asian tiger mosquito is a vector that brought dengue and chikungunya and Zika to Grenada. Listen, those vectors are all over southern United States, and you can see the difficulty of getting the U.S. health infrastructure, not the public health people who are crying about it, getting the politicians to recognize that they better put some money into that problem before it becomes a huge disaster. But again, we don't have a good track record of responding quickly to public health issues.
So, Dr. Oles, on the topic of resources, Frederick asked, say I collected a lot of money for helping deworm the world's children. Where do I send that money? And should it be, for example, the World Health Organization?
Well, I think UNICEF is a good place. The World Health Organization, you can't actually give money, I don't think, directly to the World Health Organization in that way. But there are clearly things like UNICEF and others that do that. But I'll also tell you that there are opportunities on a more micro scale that are equally important. So, you know, if I was looking for things that I would do to improve overall health, it's interesting. You know, probably the most cost-effective intervention in a developing country of any, if you wanted to spend $1 and have the biggest bang for your buck, it's interesting. Most people, what would you spend it on? I'll tell you what I would spend it on. I would spend it on the education of women. That one thing will have the most impact in the short term and the long term, and I think there's a lot of development studies that suggest that. So it's as in many settings, figuring out what would have the longest and greatest impact is an important step. Deworming children is a good thing to do. Is it more or less important than universal childhood immunization and access to free clean water, etc.? No, but as part of, you know, a plan to improve the health of communities, I think there's a role for it. If you're looking for agencies that do that, I think UNICEF would be a great one. You know, I think that many groups like Save the Children and others also work in this area because these are cost-effective ways to improve the health of, in this case, the target population, which is largely growing children.
Are there any other questions? Any call-ins?
So we don't have any other questions online right now. Does anybody have any other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand or type the questions into the chat box.
Maybe as we wrap up the session as well, if I may put Dr. Oles on the spot, maybe to get his predictions and projections going forward. We have seen a resurgence of particularly, well, not just vector-borne diseases, but mosquito-borne viral infections around the world, particularly as well in the Caribbean regions. If I were to ask you to maybe project what would be the next big outbreak and what will be required to attend to that particular burden?
Well, I already said that, you know, making guesses of what's going to happen in the future is a bit risky because we're probably better off identifying things early so that we can begin to deal with them. So, you know, Zika was a surprise, but remember that Zika existed decades ago. We knew that Zika was a virus. It actually is named after the Zika rainforest, you know, in Africa, and it was clearly a problem all the way in the Philippines, I mean, when I worked there. But no one realized its impact was happening on human populations because it had been in those areas for such a long period of time, and herd immunity had developed, etc. And so, for instance, the microcephaly issue was not known until large populations became infected with that virus, originally in Brazil. So and we have, within my lifetime, experienced the influx of an old disease or a new disease into new areas and have had unexpected impacts. So, for instance, the entire North and South America were free of cholera for a long period of time, and then it was introduced, and of course it burned through many of those countries. But interestingly, when it did this last time, the mortality from cholera was much less because we had actually implemented childhood rehydration formulas, and it turns out that although those were introduced against many of the other causes of childhood diarrhea, it actually was very effective against cholera. So, you know, in many ways, doing incremental steps to improve the health of populations have longer lasting impacts. Now, if I had to guess, they're going to fall into two categories. We're going to have the resurgence of diseases that we did not consider major health problems, and we're going to continue to have that happen. And so these are not necessarily new diseases, but they're new diseases that because there's a different vector, because something we've done in the environment has given them a niche. I mean, you know, you can list many of these examples of diseases that were restricted to a certain area of the globe that then became global problems because of changes in the environment. The second thing that we will anticipate happening is just within my lifetime, there's probably 25 brand new diseases that we didn't know existed. And so, that will continue to happen too. So there will be new diseases that will pop up that we never anticipated. And again, our strategy needs to be, we as a world need to be listening, if you will, for these events. And when we see them beginning to occur, we need to have a way of responding. One of the things that bothers me most about our current position is the world's public health infrastructure is relatively weak. And, you know, we focus a great deal on curative medicine, on treating people that have cancer and heart disease. And I'm not, that's obviously, if I had cancer or heart disease, that'd be a great thing to focus on. But we have, as a world, not just as a country, have not, in my opinion, put enough resources into the public health infrastructure, which would be the infrastructure that would help us no matter what new disease developed. And so having a stronger public health infrastructure, a stronger public health reporting system, a stronger system of early detection of things that were happening, I think is probably what I would recommend that we most do, so that we can respond quickly once we know what the problem is. And what that problem's going to be, I don't know. I think it'll be a mixture of new diseases and old diseases. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but I'm pretty sure that's what will happen.
Dr. Oles, when you were mentioning the old diseases that may be coming back, Corey asked if you would be referring to dengue fever.
Well, dengue would be a classic example of one. And remember, dengue is a little more complicated because dengue is not one disease. You know, there are 4 serotypes for dengue, and so a lot of the most serious impacts of dengue comes from a population that gets exposed to one of the serotypes, and then, let's say, a decade or so later, they get exposed to a second serotype, and the impact of dengue is going to be far more severe in that setting than just having one serotype or even several serotypes that circulate in the population for a long period of time. Probably the most devastating impacts of these things happen when you have a population that's naive to the infection, and then you introduce the infection, because just like what happened on this island with, you know, first dengue, then chikungunya, and then Zika, it has you know, it's a fertile environment because they have a lot of susceptibles, and so there's a lot of diseases that are endemic in other places of the world that will find populations which are naive to it, and they'll cause a big problem. We saw this in the United States. We could have guessed that we were going to have a problem with measles, you know, 15, 20 years earlier, because we knew that there was a growing number of humans that were not getting immunized for various you know, reasons, religious reasons, political reasons, intellectual reasons, and we knew that we would get to a threshold for which there would be an outbreak of measles or mumps, which we had both, and it's a direct result of the failure of our public health delivery system. And so, you know, common sense would tell you it's only a matter of time before we had an outbreak of measles that got everybody's attention, and now we finally have some laws to deal with it. I wish it weren't so, but it seems to me that generally to get any action, something bad has to happen, and then everybody seems to respond.
That's right.
So, Frederick, oh, continue.
No, I just wish it wasn't so, but it is.
Frederick said, I wonder if there are any viruses that are anti-helminthic but don't hurt humans.
Not that I know of. Be nice to think about that. Yeah, you know, we do a little of that in vector control. For instance, with mosquitoes, we look for ways that we can manipulate and so there would be clever things to do that, but not that I know of. And part of the reason, of course, is there are relatively few resources that are going into this. I mean, compares to, you know, HIV, malaria, TB, even TB. Actually, there's relatively little research going to TB. Most of the research dollars in the last decade went principally into HIV and hepatitis C and other diseases that are common in wealthy countries. The research for all of the neglected tropical diseases is a fraction of the research that's spent, minuscule compared to what we spend in cancer research, for instance.
I can remember in the 2009 outbreak of influenza type A H1N1, we had identified the circulating viruses in swine populations months before it was first detected in humans.
Sure.
So when we're thinking about the whole issue of early detection and monitoring for any particular environmental presence of burdens, we certainly have to bear in mind that the majority of these new emerging, re-emerging pathogens are in fact crossing the species barriers as well.
Well, and they didn't start in pigs. They actually started in the waterfowl in central China. So it actually had to go through several species to get to us. And I think influenza is a classic example of an issue that requires a One Health approach, because it's clearly a big problem for humans. It's a big problem for animals. They are intricately related. And it's interestingly which animals they are. You know, it's it is interesting that the swine basically have the characteristics of basically allowing the reassortment of the virus itself, which makes it a great amplifier of what really originated as an avian virus.
Well, if we don't have any further questions, well, we'll probably begin to conclude the session. I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have not enrolled in the course just yet, you can enroll at online.sgu.edu/anniversary, where you will receive recordings from our previous seminars, as well as engage the course throughout its length, one seminar per month, all the way into December, as we celebrate throughout 2017 our 40th anniversary here at St. George's University. I'd like to thank our online team, John Monica, John Soup, and Donna, who serves as the mechanisms behind this course, and our speakers throughout each month. And for this month, for August, we are very fortunate to have our president, Dr. Oles, who is not only an administrator here at St. George's University, but he's also an expert in the area of tropical medicine as well. We're very happy to share in his experiences and expertise for today's seminar presentation. But thank you. Enjoy the rest of your August, and we look forward to seeing you in the month of September as we continue our seminar series. So until then, thank you and goodbye for now.
Dr. Oles and Dr. Badesi, there are many thank yous from the audience, so they very much appreciate you.
No, thank you.
Thank you guys very much.